A quiet, middle school hallway. A 14-year-old girl stood frozen as whispers turned into laughter, and laughter turned into silence that no teacher dared to break. 30 students watched as she was pushed to the edge of humiliation, recording every second, doing nothing to stop it. Then, the atmosphere shifted. The school doors opened, and a man stepped inside, rain still on his jacket, eyes locked on the crowd. A former Navy SEAL. Behind him, a German Shepherd moved without a sound. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. Because what he saw wasn't just bullying anymore. It was a system protecting itself. Before we continue, tell us where you're watching from. Subscribe, and stay until the end. What happens next will expose everything they tried to hide. Cold autumn wind pressed against the brick walls of Westbrook Middle School, dragging dead leaves across the empty parking lot, and seeping through the narrow hallways where fluorescent lights buzzed like restless insects. Lily Carter walked through those halls with her shoulders slightly hunched, as if trying to make herself smaller than she already was. At 14, she was noticeably fuller in build, with soft, rounded features, and a body that never seemed to fit the narrow expectations of her classmates. Her dark brown hair, always tied back in a simple ponytail, framed a face that carried more exhaustion than her age should allow. Her eyes, warm hazel but often lowered, had learned the reflex of avoidance. She was not weak, but she had been trained by repetition, day after day of silent humiliation, to believe that invisibility was safety. Westbrook Middle was not officially a cruel place, but cruelty rarely needs official permission. It spreads through whispers, smirks, and the quiet decisions of adults who choose convenience over confrontation. Teachers here often saw what was happening, but preferred not to disrupt the fragile balance of classroom order. Students learned quickly that speaking up came with consequences, while silence came with survival. And at the center of that ecosystem stood Brandon Prescott. Brandon was the kind of boy who never had to raise his voice to be obeyed. 16, tall and sharply built, with neatly combed blonde hair and cold gray eyes that never seemed to fully warm toward anyone. He came from the Prescott family, one of the wealthiest and most influential names in the town, a fact everyone in Westbrook understood even if no one said it aloud. His father owned construction contracts tied to the city council, and his mother chaired multiple school funding committees. Brandon moved through school corridors like he owned the space, his presence accompanied by a small circle of followers who laughed a little too quickly at his jokes and looked away a little too fast when things went too far. Lily first noticed the pattern weeks ago. It started with small things, laughter behind her when she passed, notebooks mysteriously missing from her desk, comments written on her locker in thin permanent marker. Then it escalated, a hallway trip that looked accidental but wasn't, a group chat she was added to only to be removed after a flood of mocking messages. And always, Brandon's presence lingered somewhere near the center of it, never directly touching the flame, but always feeding it oxygen. The school did what institutions often do when discomfort becomes inconvenient. It redefined the problem. Teachers told Lily to ignore it. The counselor suggested she build resilience. The vice principal, a thin man named Mr. Caldwell, with graying hair and tired eyes, spoke in careful, neutral phrases that avoided assigning responsibility to anyone specific. "Teenagers can be difficult," he had said once, as if cruelty was a natural weather pattern rather than a choice. Lily learned to walk faster, speak less, and disappear into the edges of rooms. But invisibility has a cost. The more she shrank, the more visible she seemed to those who enjoyed noticing weakness. It happened on a Tuesday afternoon in the main corridor. The bell had just released a flood of students, and the noise level rose into chaotic waves of backpacks, laughter, and slammed lockers. Lily was walking toward the exit when she felt the familiar shift in the air, the subtle tightening of attention that always preceded humiliation. Brandon was standing near the trophy display case, flanked by two boys, Ethan Miller, thin and restless with nervous energy, and Kyle Harrington, heavier, with a permanently amused expression, as if everything in the world was a private joke. Brandon's posture was relaxed, but his eyes locked onto Lily with deliberate precision. "Well, look who's still here," Brandon said, loud enough for nearby students to hear, but casual enough to pretend it wasn't intentional. Lily kept walking. Her fingers tightened around the strap of her backpack. Kyle let out a short laugh. "She always walks like that," he added, "like she's trying not to take up space." A few students nearby slowed down. Some pretended not to listen. Others openly watched. Lily's heartbeat quickened, but her face remained controlled. She had learned that emotion was fuel, and fuel only made the fire burn brighter. Brandon stepped slightly into her path, not fully blocking her, just enough to force acknowledgement. "You know," he said, tilting his head, "it's kind of impressive. You manage to make the hallway feel smaller every time you're in it." A ripple of laughter passed through the small group around him. Lily stopped. She did not look at him directly. Instead, her eyes fixed on a point just past his shoulder, a strategy she had adopted to maintain some sense of control. "Can I pass?" she asked quietly. Her voice was steady, but inside her chest something tightened. Not fear, alone, anymore. Something more complicated. Fatigue. Anger that had nowhere safe to go. And beneath it, a fragile, dangerous awareness that she was being shaped by all of this in ways she did not yet understand. Brandon leaned slightly closer. "You can pass," he said softly, "when you stop acting like you're better than everyone else, just because you don't talk much." "I don't think that," Lily replied, though she knew it didn't matter what she said. Kyle pulled out his phone, pretending to check something, but Lily saw the angle of the camera subtly shift. Ethan glanced at Brandon before following suit, as if waiting for permission. That was when the system revealed itself in its most honest form, not just bullying, but documentation, recording, preserving humiliation as currency. Lily's fingers trembled slightly, but she forced them still. She took a small step forward, trying to move past Brandon without contact. For a brief second, it seemed like it might work. Then Brandon spoke again, quieter now, almost conversational. "Hey, Lily," he said. She paused despite herself. "You ever wonder why nobody steps in?" he asked. "It's not because they don't see it." Something in his tone made the air feel heavier, not anger, not excitement, something closer to certainty. Lily finally looked at him. His expression was calm, almost curious, like he was studying an experiment. Before she could respond, a teacher appeared at the far end of the corridor. Ms. Reynolds, a woman in her late 30s with tired green eyes and short black hair, always clipped tightly behind her head, glanced briefly at the group. Her gaze flickered over Lily, then Brandon, then moved on. She hesitated for half a second too long, then continued walking as if nothing unusual was happening. That hesitation said everything. Brandon smiled faintly. "See?" he murmured. Lily felt something shift inside her. Not breaking. Not yet. But bending. She pushed past him, finally breaking the invisible barrier, and walked quickly toward the exit. Behind her she heard laughter, but it sounded distant now, as if coming from underwater. Her thoughts were louder. Why doesn't anyone stop it? Not really stop it. Outside, the wind hit her face sharply. She exhaled slowly, trying to steady herself. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. A message from an unknown number lit up the screen. "You should learn your place before someone teaches it to you properly." Lily stared at the words for a long moment. The sender was unknown, but the implication was not. Behind her, inside the school, the bell rang again. Another cycle beginning. Another day resetting itself into silence. And somewhere deep inside that system, unseen but connected, something was watching her more closely than before. She did not know it yet, but the attention had already changed direction. The rain fell in thin, restless sheets over the quiet suburban streets, blurring the world into gray reflections of headlights and wet asphalt, as Marcus Carter drove toward Westbrook Middle School, with both hands locked tightly on the steering wheel. Marcus Carter was a former Navy SEAL in his early 40s, though years out of service had softened neither his presence nor the instinctive discipline in his posture. He had a broad, athletic frame, shoulders still carrying the memory of combat training, and short dark hair with traces of silver beginning at the temples. His face was sharply structured, with a square jaw covered in a close-trimmed beard, and deep-set brown eyes that rarely missed detail. To strangers, he appeared calm, almost controlled, but those who looked closely could sense something contained beneath him. An alertness shaped by years of high-pressure missions and irreversible loss. Since leaving the military, Marcus had tried to build a quieter life, working in private security consulting, believing that distance from violence would also protect his daughter from it. That belief had begun to fracture long before today. His phone buzzed repeatedly on the passenger seat, but he ignored it. The call from the school had been brief, carefully worded, and unsettling in its vagueness. Incident involving your daughter. Please come immediately. Nothing more. No clarity. No accountability. Just the language institutions used when they wanted urgency, without responsibility. Inside the school building, Lily Carter sat alone in the counseling office. The room was small, painted in a neutral beige, meant to feel calming, but instead felt sterile, like a space designed to contain problems rather than solve them. Lily's hands rested in her lap, fingers slightly trembling. Her face was pale, her hazel eyes fixed on the floor. She had not cried in front of anyone yet, but the emotional pressure inside her was no longer something she could fully suppress. Across from her sat Mr. Caldwell, the vice principal. He was a thin man in his 50s with receding gray hair, wearing a neatly pressed shirt and tie that felt too formal for his tired demeanor. His expression carried practiced neutrality, the kind developed by administrators who had learned to survive conflict by softening its edges until nothing remained sharp enough to demand action. He spoke carefully, choosing words that avoided commitment. "Lily," he said gently, folding his hands on the desk, "we're looking into the situation. These matters can be complex. Sometimes misunderstandings escalate between students." Lily did not respond. She had heard variations of this sentence before, each time stripping away a little more of her expectation that adults would intervene meaningfully. Her silence was not agreement. It was exhaustion. Mr. Caldwell continued, "Brandon is a strong student, well-connected. There may be external pressures influencing perceptions here. We need to be cautious before making conclusions." That word, cautious, landed heavily in the room. It did not feel like protection. It felt like avoidance, dressed as professionalism. The door opened suddenly. Marcus Carter entered without knocking, rain still clinging to his jacket. His presence changed the air immediately. He scanned the room in one motion, taking in Lily's posture, her expression, the administrator's controlled demeanor. His eyes softened only when they landed on his daughter. "Lily," he said quietly. Lily looked up, and something inside her broke in a way that was not collapse, but release. She stood quickly and crossed the room, collapsing into her father's arms. Marcus held her firmly, his jaw tightening, as he felt how small she seemed in that moment. Not physically, but emotionally, compressed by weeks of pressure she had carried alone. Mr. Caldwell stood as well, adjusting his tie slightly. "Mr. Carter," he began, "we are addressing the situation internally." Marcus did not immediately respond. Instead, he gently guided Lily to sit again, then turned his attention fully to the vice principal. His voice, when it came, was controlled, but sharp beneath the surface. "Addressing it how?" he asked. A pause followed. Mr. Caldwell shifted his weight slightly. "We're mediating between students. We encourage conflict resolution approaches." "There is no conflict," Marcus interrupted calmly. "There is a pattern." The room tightened. Lily watched her father carefully. She recognized that tone, not anger, but calculation, the same tone he had used in training stories he rarely shared. At that moment, the door opened again. A school counselor, Ms. Elaine Foster, entered. She was a woman in her late 30s with shoulder-length auburn hair tied loosely at the back, wearing a soft gray cardigan over a white blouse. Her face carried a tired compassion, the kind shaped by years of listening to problems she could not fully solve. She glanced between Marcus, Lily, and Mr. Caldwell, sensing tension immediately. "I think it would help," she said cautiously, "if we all take a step back and ensure emotional clarity before proceeding." Marcus looked at her briefly. "Emotional clarity is not the issue," he replied. "Accountability is." Silence followed. Lily lowered her gaze again. But now it was not shame. It was confusion, mixed with a fragile sense of something shifting. 2 days earlier, Sarah Chen had entered this story indirectly. Now she entered it physically. Sarah Chen was a journalist in her early 30s, with sharp, analytical eyes and a composed demeanor that suggested she had spent years working in environments where truth often had to be extracted rather than offered. She had straight black hair cut just above her shoulders, a slim build, and a habit of observing before speaking. Her presence in Westbrook had not been accidental. She had been investigating patterns of misconduct in local institutions tied to political donations, and the Prescott family name had surfaced more than once in her research. She met Marcus in a quiet parking lot outside the school later that afternoon. Rain had slowed, but the air remained heavy. "You're Marcus Carter," she said, not as a question, but confirmation. "And you are?" Marcus asked. "Sarah Chen." "Investigative journalist." She paused briefly, studying him. "Your daughter's situation is not isolated." Marcus's expression tightened slightly. "I already know that." Sarah nodded, as if expecting that answer. "Then you also know it won't stop on its own." She opened a folder, revealing printed screenshots, partial records, and redacted disciplinary logs. Marcus scanned them quickly. Patterns emerged immediately. Similar complaints, similar outcomes, always unresolved in favor of certain students. "Brandon Prescott," Marcus said quietly. Sarah's eyes narrowed slightly. "His family has influence across school funding channels and local council decisions. Official complaints tend to disappear before they become formal cases." Marcus closed the folder gently. "Then we stop it before it disappears again." Inside the school, Lily returned to class under pressure that felt heavier than before. Not because of what had been said openly, but because of what had not changed. Brandon Prescott was still there, still smiling, still surrounded by silence that protected him more effectively than any rulebook. In the hallway between classes, Brandon watched her pass. This time, his expression was different, less playful, more observant, as if something had shifted in how he perceived her. Ethan Miller leaned toward him. "Her dad showed up," he muttered. Brandon did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched Lily until she turned a corner. Then he spoke softly. "That doesn't change anything." But for the first time, his certainty was not complete. That evening, Lily sat in her room, staring at her phone again. The message from the unknown number remained unanswered. Another message arrived moments later. "You are being watched." Her breathing slowed. Not panic. Not yet. Something more unsettling. Awareness. Downstairs, Marcus stood in the kitchen reviewing the printed material Sarah had given him. His face was still, but his mind was already reorganizing the situation into something structured, tactical, and deeply personal. This was no longer just about school discipline. It was about a system that had already decided who it would protect. And systems, he knew, only responded to pressure they could not ignore. Outside, the rain began again, heavier this time, as if the weather itself had decided to stay. The city looked different at night when seen through the lens of investigation, every streetlight becoming a fixed point in a larger pattern that Marcus Carter now instinctively tried to map as he drove through the quiet outskirts of Westbrook toward an abandoned industrial office building Sarah Chen had chosen as a meeting point. Marcus Carter had not slept properly in 2 days. His body still carried the discipline of a former Navy SEAL. Upright posture, controlled breathing, constant environmental awareness, but his mind was now anchored to something more personal than any mission he had ever been assigned. The image of his daughter's silence stayed with him, not as fragility but as accumulation of pressure. He understood operational threats. What he was beginning to confront here was different. A system that did not rely on force, but on permission structures and silence. The building Sarah selected was once part of a logistics company that went bankrupt years ago. Its exterior was faded concrete, windows partially boarded, and signage long removed. Inside, however, one room had been modified. Portable lighting, laptops, a whiteboard filled with handwritten notes, and red strings connecting names and incidents. It resembled a field operations center, more than a newsroom setup. Sarah Chen stood near the whiteboard when Marcus entered. She was wearing a dark navy jacket over a plain shirt, her black hair tied back more tightly than before. Her face carried focused exhaustion, the kind of fatigue that came from prolonged exposure to incomplete truths. Sarah was in her early 30s, slim, with sharp cheekbones and dark, observant eyes that rarely missed micro-expressions. She had built her career moving between corporate corruption cases and institutional abuse investigations, often working alone because organizations preferred stories to remain fragmented. Behind her, a man was already working on a laptop. This was Miguel Alvarez. He was in his late 20s, thin and slightly hunched from long hours in front of screens. His skin was light brown, his hair messy and unstyled, and he wore rectangular glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. Miguel had once worked in cybersecurity for a private tech firm before being dismissed after exposing internal data manipulation practices. That experience had left him skeptical of authority systems, but extremely precise in digital reconstruction. His personality was quiet, analytical, and emotionally detached when working, as if empathy might interfere with accuracy. Miguel briefly looked up. "You're the SEAL," he said simply, then returned to his screen. Marcus nodded once. "I'm here." Sarah gestured toward the whiteboard. "We don't have a full structure yet, but we have fragments, enough to see a pattern forming." Marcus stepped closer. On the board were names. Brandon Prescott at the center, surrounded by smaller nodes, students, faculty members, and administrative positions. Lines connected them to incidents labeled only by dates and vague descriptors. What stood out most was not the content, but the repetition. Complaints that always stopped at the same administrative threshold. Reports that disappeared after review. Digital logs showing editing access from restricted accounts. "This isn't random," Marcus said quietly. "No," Sarah replied. "It's controlled." Miguel tapped a key and turned the laptop toward them. "I pulled metadata from archived school communication logs. Someone inside the system has elevated access. They've been altering disciplinary records for at least 2 years. Every case involving Prescott gets reclassified or softened within 48 hours." Marcus studied the data without speaking. His mind did what it had always done in operational environments. It translated chaos into structure. This was not a school issue anymore. It was an embedded protection mechanism. Sarah crossed her arms. "We also found something else." She pulled out printed screenshots showing anonymized testimonies. Multiple students, different years, similar behavioral patterns. Isolation, intimidation, coercion. None had been formally escalated. Most were quietly transferred or had their complaints withdrawn. "What we're seeing," Sarah continued, "is a network of silence reinforced by financial dependency. The Prescott family donates heavily to the school district, but more importantly, they influence contractor approvals, scholarship allocations, and even extracurricular funding." Marcus exhaled slowly. "So they don't just protect Brandon. They own the environment that protects him." Sarah nodded. "Exactly." At that moment, Miguel's screen flashed. A notification appeared. "Unauthorized access attempt detected." He frowned slightly. "That's not normal." Marcus immediately straightened. "What is it?" Miguel's fingers moved quickly across the keyboard. Someone is probing the data cluster I'm accessing. Not external. It's internal network awareness. They know we're pulling records. Sarah's expression tightened. Already? Marcus didn't respond verbally. Instead, his posture shifted subtly. Weight distribution adjusted. Eyes scanning exits. Assessing threat direction. Old reflexes resurfaced without effort. Miguel minimized the window. I've masked our entry point, but whoever it is, they're not amateurs. Sarah leaned closer. Prescott's legal team? Unlikely, Miguel said. This feels more technical. Like someone embedded in the system itself. Marcus looked at the board again. Then they're not reacting to us, he said. They're reacting to exposure. A silence followed that felt heavier than before. Meanwhile, across town, Lily Carter sat in her bedroom with the lights off, staring at her phone screen. The message history remained minimal, but the psychological weight had increased. You are being watched was still visible. No follow-up. No explanation. Just presence. Her window was slightly open, letting in the cold air. Every small sound outside, the distant traffic, wind brushing against trees, felt amplified. She had begun noticing patterns she never paid attention to before. A car passing twice. A figure standing too long near a corner. Logic told her it could be coincidence, but instinct no longer accepted coincidence easily. At school the next day, Brandon Prescott appeared unchanged outwardly. He still moved through hallways with the same controlled confidence, but something subtle had shifted. His conversations were shorter, his attention more focused. He was observing now, not just performing. Ethan Miller noticed first. You okay? He asked quietly during lunch. Brandon didn't look up from his tray. Someone's digging. Digging what? Brandon paused. Then he said, Doesn't matter. It'll stop. His tone was calm, but the certainty behind it was no longer effortless. It had weight now, like a statement that required reinforcement rather than assumed authority. That evening, Sarah Chen expanded the operation. She contacted a former administrative staff member from Westbrook Middle School. The man, Daniel Hargrove, was in his 50s with thinning gray hair, a tired face marked by years of institutional fatigue, and a habit of speaking slowly, as if every sentence required internal negotiation before being spoken aloud. He met Sarah in a public cafe, avoiding direct eye contact at first. I shouldn't be here, Daniel muttered. You're already involved, Sarah replied, calmly. Daniel exhaled and rubbed his hands together. You don't understand how deep it goes. The Prescott family doesn't just influence decisions. They anticipate them. Files get adjusted before complaints even finalize. There are standing instructions. Marcus, who had joined Sarah, leaned forward slightly. From whom? Daniel hesitated. Board level, maybe higher. I don't know names. I just know what I was told to do. Why speak now? Marcus asked. Daniel looked down at his cup. Because I have a daughter too. That sentence changed the air in the room. Back at the investigative hub, Miguel identified something critical. I traced the internal access pattern, he said. It's not just one person. It's layered permissions, like a hierarchy of editing rights. Sarah frowned. Meaning someone is protecting the system, not just individuals. Marcus stared at the data. The implication was clear. Brandon Prescott was not the center of the structure. He was the visible point of it. And visibility, Marcus understood, was often used to distract from the architecture behind it. Later that night, Lily received another message. This time, it was shorter. Stop looking where you don't belong. She closed her eyes, but sleep did not come easily anymore. For the first time, she began to feel something she had not felt before in this situation. Not just fear, but connection. as if what was happening around her was no longer isolated events, but part of something larger moving toward her. And somewhere in that larger structure, someone had just acknowledged her awareness. The morning news cycle in Westbrook began with the kind of controlled calm that usually preceded disruption. Soft headlines, weather updates, community events. Nothing that suggested the quiet machinery beneath the surface had already begun to shift. But inside Marcus Carter's temporary operation space, there was no calm at all, only acceleration. Marcus stood by a wall-mounted monitor while Sarah Chen scrolled through incoming data feeds. The room was dim, lit only by screens and a single overhead lamp. Outside, the city moved normally, unaware that its internal structure was being mapped in real time. Sarah Chen looked more exhausted than before. Her hair, still black and tied back, had loosened slightly, and faint shadows under her eyes revealed she had not slept properly. She had the focused appearance of someone operating under sustained pressure, but her voice remained steady. Years of investigative journalism had trained her to function inside instability without showing it. Miguel Alvarez was already at his station, fingers moving rapidly across multiple keyboards. His face was pale from concentration, glasses reflecting streams of code and logs. He did not speak unless necessary, but his silence was not passive. It was analytical absorption. "We're being pushed back," Miguel said finally. Marcus turned. "Explain." Miguel brought up a network visualization. After the last access attempt, their system initiated counter protocols, not just defensive locks. They're actively sanitizing records again, faster than before. Sarah leaned in. "They're reacting to exposure escalation," Miguel nodded, "and they've upgraded their response threshold. Someone authorized deeper control permissions." Marcus studied the shifting nodes on the screen. "Meaning they know we're not just observing anymore." "Yes," Miguel replied. "We're inside their attention radius." A heavy silence followed. It was one thing to investigate a system. It was another to be acknowledged by it. At Westbrook Middle School, the environment had subtly changed, though most students could not articulate how. It was not visible disruption, but behavioral recalibration. Teachers spoke more cautiously. Administrative announcements became more frequent. Certain students were quietly removed from group activities without explanation. Brandon Prescott noticed these shifts before anyone else. He stood near the science wing hallway, leaning casually against the wall, with two students beside him. One was Ethan Miller, thinner and more anxious than before, his eyes constantly scanning surroundings. The other was Kyle Harrington, whose usual humor had become subdued. "You're overreacting," Kyle said, attempting a laugh that didn't fully form. Brandon didn't respond immediately. His expression was controlled, but his attention was elsewhere, measuring, recalculating. "They're not stopping," he said quietly. "So, we adjust." Ethan swallowed. What if it's not just students this time? That question hung in the air longer than expected. Brandon finally looked at him. His gray eyes were steady, but colder now. "Then we remind them what happens when people dig too deep." He said it without raising his voice. That was what made it more unsettling. Meanwhile, Sarah Chen expanded her external network. She met a man named Officer Raymond Cole in a quiet parking structure near the outskirts of town. Cole was in his early 40s, a former internal affairs investigator who had left the department under unclear circumstances. He had a stocky build, short-cropped dark hair, with a receding hairline, and a permanent 5 o'clock shadow that gave him a tired, hardened appearance. His manner of speaking was direct, often blunt, shaped by years of exposure to institutional contradictions. "I don't do favors anymore," Cole said immediately as Sarah approached. "This isn't a favor," Sarah replied. "It's documentation." Cole snorted lightly. "That's what everyone says before things get dangerous." Marcus, standing slightly behind Sarah, stepped forward. "It already is." Cole looked at Marcus for a moment, assessing him in the way experienced officers assess threats and allies simultaneously. You military? He asked. Former, Marcus replied. Cole nodded slowly, as if that confirmed something. Then you understand how systems protect themselves better than people do. Sarah handed him a drive. We need to know if this pattern exists in your records. Cole hesitated, then accepted it. If I open this, I'm back in it. You were never out of it, Marcus said quietly. That statement landed differently than intended. Cole did not respond immediately. Instead, he studied Marcus again, then nodded once. Inside the investigation hub, Miguel's screen suddenly flashed red. Another intrusion attempt, he said quickly. Sarah moved closer. Source? Miguel tracked it. Same internal network, but this time they're not probing. They're isolating specific files. Marcus stepped in. Which files? Miguel hesitated. Student complaint archives. Lily Carter's records are being targeted. That name shifted the entire room's energy. Marcus's expression tightened. They're focusing on her specifically. Sarah's voice lowered. That means she's not just a subject of bullying anymore. She's a trigger point. Miguel minimized the screen. They're trying to erase her digital footprint. Marcus turned slightly, thinking. Or control how she's perceived. A notification appeared on Sarah's secure channel. She opened it, scanned quickly, and her expression changed. They're escalating publicly, she said. What does that mean? Marcus asked. Sarah showed him her phone. A local news outlet had published a short segment. Concerns raised over disruptive external influence in school affairs. The article did not mention names directly, but the framing was clear. A narrative was forming. An external agitator interfering with school stability, potentially harming students emotionally. Marcus read it once, then set the phone down. They're shifting perception. Sarah nodded. They're building a counter-story before ours fully forms. Miguel added, that's classic containment strategy. If they can't stop data exposure, they discredit interpretation. Marcus exhaled slowly. Then they're no longer hiding. They're defending. At school, Lily noticed changes that she could not fully understand, but instinctively felt. Conversation stopped when she entered rooms. Teachers who previously ignored her now avoided eye contact. Even students who once mocked her directly now seemed cautious, as if unsure what was safe to say. Brandon no longer approached her directly. Instead, his presence was distributed, felt indirectly through others. Whispered comments, fragmented glances, controlled silence. During lunch, Lily sat alone as usual. Her tray remained mostly untouched. Her phone vibrated once. No message, just a blank notification. Yet even that felt intentional. Across the cafeteria, Brandon watched her briefly before turning away. For the first time, his expression was not dismissive. It was evaluative. That evening, Sarah met Daniel Hargrove again, the former school administrator. He looked worse than before, eyes more sunken, movements slower, as if the act of speaking truth was physically draining him. They know someone is leaking information, Daniel said immediately. Who? Sarah asked. Daniel shook his head. I don't know, but internal communications changed yesterday. New directives were issued. Anything related to Prescott is now classified under sensitive institutional stability. That means restricted access even for mid-level staff. Marcus listened carefully. So they've escalated classification levels. Daniel nodded. And they've begun auditing employee behavior. Miguel, reviewing remote logs, confirmed this later. They're tracking internal access patterns. Anyone querying those records is now flagged. Sarah crossed her arms. We've officially triggered institutional defense mode. Marcus's voice remained steady. Good. Sarah looked at him. Good. Marcus met her gaze. It means we're no longer invisible. At that moment, Miguel's system triggered another alert. This one was different. He frowned. We have a direct trace attempt. Sarah moved closer. From where? Miguel stared at the screen. External connection routed through school infrastructure, but it's not automated. Marcus immediately understood. Someone is actively trying to identify us. Miguel nodded. Yes, and they're getting closer. Silence settled in the room, but it was no longer uncertainty. It was acknowledgement of escalation. Back at home, Lily sat in her room again. The window was now fully closed, but she still felt exposed. Another message appeared on her phone. You are not just watching anymore. You are part of it. She stared at it longer than before. Her breathing slowed, not from fear alone, but from recognition that something larger had fully acknowledged her presence. And for the first time, she understood that silence was no longer protection. It was participation. The early morning fog settled over Westbrook like a heavy curtain, muting the town's edges and softening its familiar structures into something uncertain, as if reality itself was waiting for an outcome before deciding what form to take next. Inside the temporary operation space, Marcus Carter stood motionless in front of the whiteboard. The network of names, incidents, and connections had expanded over the past days into a dense structure that no longer resembled fragments, but an ecosystem of concealment. Every line pointed toward Brandon Prescott, yet every supporting branch revealed something larger beneath him. Marcus no longer viewed it as a school case. It had become a controlled environment where behavior was shaped, recorded, and corrected through invisible mechanisms. Sarah Chen stood beside him, her posture steady but her expression sharpened by exhaustion. Her black hair was tied back tightly, emphasizing the angular structure of her face. Years of investigative reporting had given her a calm exterior under pressure, but her eyes revealed constant calculation. She was not simply gathering evidence anymore. She was anticipating resistance. Miguel Alvarez worked silently at his terminal, but the tension in his posture had changed. His usual detachment had shifted into urgency. Multiple monitors displayed synchronized data streams, archived records, communication logs, and reconstructed file histories. He had spent the night rebuilding corrupted segments that the system had attempted to erase, and what he recovered no longer left ambiguity. It's all there, Miguel said quietly. Marcus turned toward him. Everything? Miguel nodded. Video logs, complaint submissions, internal review edits, access trails. They didn't just suppress incidents. They curated outcomes. Sarah leaned forward. Can it be presented cleanly? Miguel hesitated for the first time. Yes, but once it's exposed, it won't remain stable for long. Systems like this respond aggressively when fully revealed. Marcus understood what that meant. Exposure was not the end. It was the trigger. Sarah opened her laptop and connected to her secure publishing channel. Then, we don't wait. At Westbrook Middle School, the atmosphere had grown heavier in a way students could not fully articulate. It was not louder, nor more chaotic. It was restrained, as if every interaction had begun to carry unseen weight. Teachers spoke less freely. Administrative staff moved with increased awareness of surveillance protocols. Even casual conversations seemed filtered through caution. Brandon Prescott stood in the administrative corridor outside the principal's office. He was composed outwardly, dressed neatly as always, but his posture carried a different quality now. Less arrogance, more containment. His blonde hair was perfectly arranged, but his gray eyes were fixed on something unseen. Beside him was Ethan Miller, who had grown increasingly anxious over the past days. His hands were constantly fidgeting, his gaze avoiding direct alignment with anything that felt authoritative. They're going to release something, Ethan whispered. Brandon did not immediately respond. When he did, his voice was low. Let them. Kyle Harrington approached moments later, his earlier humor completely absent. Rumors are spreading, he said. Not just students. Teachers, too. Brandon finally turned slightly. Good. Let it spread. Ethan frowned. That's not good. Brandon's expression remained controlled. It is when you understand direction. Inside the operation space, Sarah Chen finalized the publication packet. The article was no longer a single narrative, but a structured disclosure. Documented cases of behavioral suppression, administrative manipulation, and systemic shielding of student misconduct. Names were redacted only where legally necessary, but the pattern was unmistakable. The Prescott family influence was referenced through verifiable financial and administrative links. "This goes live in 10 minutes, Sarah said. Marcus stood behind her. "Once it's public, there's no containment." Sarah looked up at him. "That's the point." Miguel monitored external network activity. "We're already being scanned," he said. "Multiple endpoints. They're preparing countermeasures." Marcus's voice remained steady. "Let them react. We're done waiting." At that moment, Miguel's screen flickered. A new alert appeared. "They're initiating system-wide lockdown protocols at the school district server level." Sarah narrowed her eyes. "That's faster than expected." Miguel analyzed the sequence. "They're not responding to the article. They're responding to internal breach confirmation. Someone inside confirmed exposure is imminent." Marcus understood immediately. "They're collapsing their own system boundaries to prevent spread." Miguel nodded. "Yes, and that means they're isolating Westbrook entirely." At school, administrative announcements suddenly shifted tone. Students were instructed to remain in classrooms. Internet access on school devices was restricted. External communication channels were temporarily disabled under system maintenance. Brandon observed the changes with quiet focus. This was no longer reaction. It was restructuring. During lunch, Lily Carter sat in the corner of the cafeteria as usual, but something had changed in the way others looked at her. Not hostility, not curiosity, awareness. As if her existence had become associated with something larger than herself, she noticed Brandon watching her from across the room. His expression was unreadable, but for the first time, it did not feel like control. It felt like acknowledgement. Her phone vibrated. No message appeared this time, only a blank notification, but Lily no longer needed words to understand that something had reached its conclusion. That evening, Sarah's publication went live. Within minutes, engagement surged beyond expectations. Local social media channels picked it up first, followed by regional news aggregators. The structured evidence, screenshots, metadata summaries, redacted internal logs created immediate public disruption. The narrative could no longer be framed as isolated incidents. Marcus watched the analytics in silence as the system reacted in real time. Traffic spikes, counter-narrative posts, and defensive statements from affiliated institutions began appearing almost simultaneously. Miguel pointed at the screen. "They're deploying response teams." Sarah nodded. "Media containment." Marcus spoke quietly. "Too late." At Westbrook administration, internal panic was no longer hidden. Staff communications escalated rapidly. The principal, Dr. Harold Weston, a man in his 60s with thinning white hair and a rigid posture shaped by decades of institutional hierarchy, was seen moving between offices with increasing urgency. His usual composed demeanor had fractured into visible stress. "This is being handled," he repeated to staff, though his tone suggested otherwise. But the system beneath him was no longer stable. At home that night, Lily sat by her window. The town outside looked unchanged, but she no longer perceived it as static. Everything felt connected now. Names, actions, silence, exposure. The boundaries that once separated her experience from the wider structure had dissolved. Her phone lit up one final time. "You are no longer alone in this." Lily closed her eyes. For the first time, she did not feel smaller. She felt seen. And somewhere, far beyond her immediate understanding, the system that had protected itself for years was now fully exposed to the light it had avoided. Sometimes truth does not arrive as a thunderstorm, but as a quiet fracture in a system that believed it would never be seen. What happened in Westbrook was not just a story of bullying or silence. It was a reminder that even the most protected darkness can be exposed when courage refuses to step back. In everyday life, the same truth still applies. Silence protects harm, but awareness can end it. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to be reminded that speaking up still matters. Leave a comment with your thoughts. Subscribe for more stories like this, and stay connected for future episodes. And may God bless and protect all those who are still unheard, still struggling, and still waiting for justice to find them. Sometimes miracles do not come as magic. They come as people who refuse to stay silent,